Dr. Zeleth stood motionless before the holographic display, her forearms hanging limp at her sides as the numbers confirmed what she already knew. Another simulation failure. Another dead end. The soft blue light from the projection cast shadows across her laboratory aboard the research vessel Ascending Wisdom, illuminating the careful chaos of a scientist who had long ago stopped pretending she had all the answers. 2.3 million. That was how many Esrilith remained in the galaxy. 2 centuries ago, there had been 8 billion. The withering plague had reduced her species from a thriving galactic civilization to a dying whisper, and despite 4 decades of research, despite her considerable reputation and resources, despite everything she had sacrificed, Zeleth was no closer to a cure than the day she had begun. She reached out with her upper right hand and dismissed the display. The laboratory fell into darkness except for the ambient glow of dormant equipment. Her scales, normally a vibrant cascade of teal and silver that shifted with her emotions, had dulled to a tired gray-green. Not the gray of the withering plague, not yet, but the gray of exhaustion that went bone-deep. The communication terminal chimed. Zeleth's compound eyes, which could perceive spectrums of light most species couldn't imagine, focused on the incoming call identifier. Keseth, her younger sister. A cold sensation spread through Zeleth's thorax. She accepted the call. Keseth's face appeared, trying to smile, trying to be brave. But Zeleth saw immediately what her sister was attempting to hide. There, on the lower left arm visible in the frame, a patch of scales had lost their iridescence. They were the flat, lifeless gray that every Esrilith had learned to fear. "It's early stage," Keseth said, her voice carrying false lightness. "The doctors say I have 10 years, maybe 15. 10 to 15 years. A death sentence delivered with clinical precision." Zeleth felt her scales flush deep purple, the color of grief, before she forced them back to neutral tones. She couldn't let Keseth see her despair. "I won't stop searching," Zeleth said. It was a promise she had made before, to other family members, to friends, to herself. A promise she had failed to keep every time. After the call ended, Zeleth stood in the darkness of her laboratory for a long time. The Ascending Wisdom was scheduled to dock at some minor agricultural world for resupply in a few hours. Perhaps she would leave the ship, she thought. Perhaps she would walk among living things and pretend, for a moment, that death was not inevitable. Verdant rest was beautiful in a way that core worlds had forgotten how to be. The human colony sprawled across rolling hills, covered in vegetation so lush and varied that Zeleth found herself stopping repeatedly just to process the sheer diversity. She had read that humans were obsessive about preserving Earth's biosphere, scattering seeds across their colonies like some species' scattered offspring, but she had not expected this riot of color and life. The market district was crowded with various species, but humans dominated. They moved with characteristic energy, always slightly too fast, always slightly too loud. Zeleth had worked with humans before and found them simultaneously exhausting and oddly endearing. They felt everything so intensely, wore their emotions where anyone could see them, and seemed constitutionally incapable of accepting the word impossible. She was drawn to a stall by the sheer improbability of its inventory. Dozens of plant species were arranged in careful display: fruits, vegetables, flowers, fungi, things she couldn't even categorize. The human tending the stall was older, perhaps 50 or 60 by their reckoning, with gray threading through his dark hair and smile lines around his eyes that suggested he spent considerable time happy. "Beautiful, aren't they?" the human said, noticing her attention. His galactic standard was accented but clear. "I'm James Chen. These are all from Earth originally, though they've adapted to verdant rest pretty well." "The variety is unusual," Zeleth observed. "Most agricultural operations focus on efficiency," James laughed. "Yeah, I get that feedback from the corporate types. They think I'm wasting space and resources, but I figure someone should keep the diversity alive. You never know when you'll need something specific." There was something in his tone, a philosophy that reminded Zeleth of old Esrilith wisdom from before they had become so focused on technological solutions. She found herself lingering, asking questions about his work. James answered enthusiastically, clearly delighted to have someone interested in his plants. I'm a medical researcher, Zeleth offered when he asked about her presence on verdant rest, studying genetic diseases. Anything specific? James asked, and she could see genuine curiosity in his expression. She explained the withering plague, falling into technical language despite herself. The genetic degradation, the cellular apoptosis, the way S-rillith chromatin structure simply forgot how to maintain coherence. James listened with an intensity that surprised her, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated he was following the concepts even without formal training. So it's like your DNA just forgets how to repair itself, he said finally. Zeleth felt her scales shift to amber, surprised recognition. That was exactly right, stripped of jargon and reduced to essential truth. Yes, precisely that. James was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant in the way humans got when thinking deeply. Then he looked back at her. This might sound strange, but the way you describe it reminds me of something I've been growing. Probably won't help, but would you like to see? Zeleth had heard countless miracle cure claims over the decades. Well-meaning individuals from dozens of species, all convinced they had found the answer. She had learned to politely decline, but something about James's demeanor stopped her. He wasn't claiming anything, wasn't promising salvation. He was simply offering to show her something interesting. Yes, she said, I would. The greenhouse complex sprawled across several acres, a series of interconnected biodomes that regulated temperature, humidity, and atmospheric composition for different plant families. James led her through sections devoted to fruits, vegetables, grains, each containing more variety than Zeleth had seen in most planetary agricultural systems. This is my life's work, James explained as they walked. After my wife died, I left Earth, needed a fresh start. But I couldn't bear the idea of leaving her garden behind, all the plants she'd loved. So I brought samples of everything I could, started this place. The colonial authority thinks I'm eccentric, but they tolerate me because I do provide food for the settlement. There was grief in his voice, old but not forgotten. Zeleth understood that intimately. They entered a climate-controlled chamber devoted to fungi. The air was cool and damp, rich with the scent of growing things. James guided her to a specific cultivation bed where mushrooms with faintly luminescent blue spots grew in clusters. This is a modified strain of Armillaria ostii, James said. Honey fungus from Earth. I've been adapting it to grow on verdant rest's native woods. It's part of my long-term terraforming research, seeing how Earth species integrate with alien ecosystems. He carefully harvested a small sample and placed it under a basic optical microscope. But here's what caught my attention. See these crystalline structures forming in the mycelium. Zeleth looked through the microscope, and her scales immediately flushed bright orange, shock and excitement. The crystalline formations had a molecular pattern that was eerily, impossibly familiar. It resembled the theoretical compounds she had been modeling for years, proteins that might stabilize degrading genetic material. How long have you been growing this strain? She asked, struggling to keep her voice neutral. About 3 years. Why? Is it interesting? Interesting? That was such an inadequate word. Zeleth felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, hope. May I take samples back to my ship for analysis? James began preparing specimens immediately. Take whatever you need. If it helps your research, that's payment enough. That night, in her laboratory aboard the Ascending Wisdom, Zeleth ran comprehensive analyses on the fungal samples. The compound the mushrooms produced, she designated it chenomycin in her notes, after the human who had grown it, had several remarkable properties that made her scales cycle through colors faster than she could control them. The protein structures could attach to degrading genetic material and essentially template proper formation, not forcing repair through brute chemical intervention, but gently reminding cells of their correct patterns. The mechanism was elegant, adaptive, almost intelligent in how it responded to different genetic configurations. But it wasn't quite right for S-rillith biology. The molecular structure needed modification, refinement. She ran simulation after simulation, each one showing promise but not certainty. By the 3rd day, she had a theoretical framework for how chenomycin might be modified to work with S-rillith genetic structure. By the 5th day, She knew she needed help. Specifically, she needed James's expertise in cultivation and adaptation. The collaboration began awkwardly. Zeleth was accustomed to working with other scientists, individuals who understood research protocols and experimental controls. James was enthusiastic but undisciplined, suggesting experiments that seemed to rely more on intuition than methodology. "Why don't we try growing the fungus in different mineral solutions?" James suggested during one of their daily video calls. "Expose it to samples of S-Rilith genetic material, let it adapt naturally." "That's not how this works," Zeleth said, her scales flashing yellow with frustration. "We need controlled conditions, precise measurements." "Sure, for testing," James agreed. "But for development, sometimes you need to let nature experiment. On Earth, we spent thousands of years breeding plants without understanding genetics. We just kept the ones that did what we wanted and grew more of those. Evolution in fast forward." It was an absurd suggestion, unscientific, imprecise, but Zeleth was desperate, and desperation bred flexibility. She created a controlled environment where samples of the fungus were exposed to simulated S-Rilith cellular conditions, providing it with the chemical and genetic information it would encounter in a living S-Rilith body. "Think of it like teaching," James said. "You're showing the fungus what you need. Give it time to learn." The fungus learned. Over the following weeks, Zeleth observed the chenomycin-producing structures adapt, shifting their molecular output in response to the S-Rilith genetic samples. The modifications were subtle but significant, each generation of fungal growth producing compounds slightly better suited to stabilizing S-Rilith DNA. By week 6, the cultivated strain was producing a variant of chenomycin that matched her theoretical models almost perfectly. Zeleth ran it through every simulation protocol in her database. The results were extraordinary. In theory, the compound could halt withering plague progression. In early-stage cases, it might even reverse the damage. But simulations were not reality. She needed to test it on living S-Rilith tissue. She needed a trial subject. Dr. Morvin Kess, the Pleiadian administrator overseeing medical research in this sector, reviewed Zeleth's data with characteristic thoroughness. Pleiadians were meticulous creatures, crystalline beings who thought in matrices and probabilities. Kess had been supportive of Zeleth's research, but was bound by regulations that existed for good reasons. "The compound shows promise," Kess said, her voice like wind chimes. "But standard trial protocols require years of testing. Tissue samples, then simple organisms, then complex organisms, then—" "We don't have years," Zeleth interrupted. Her scales were dark blue, determination mixed with despair. "S-Rilith are dying every day. Every delay means more deaths. I understand your urgency, but rushing to trials could do more harm than good. If the compound has unforeseen side effects, then test it on me." The words hung in the air between them. Kess's crystalline form flickered, the Pleiadian equivalent of surprise. "You're not seriously suggesting—" "I am in early stages of the withering plague," Zeleth said flatly. Her scales flushed the gray of admission of truth too long hidden. She extended her lower left arm, showing patches where her scales had lost their iridescence. "It began 6 months ago. I've been documenting my own deterioration while searching for a cure." Kess was silent for a long moment. Then, "That's why you've been so driven." "That's why I'm the perfect test subject. I'm going to die anyway. Let my death have meaning." The argument that followed was intense. Kess cited regulations, ethics, the danger of researchers experimenting on themselves. Zeleth countered with the mathematics of extinction, with the reality that traditional protocols were a luxury her species could not afford. James, brought into the discussion via long-distance communication, looked deeply uncomfortable. "I don't want anyone risking their life because of mushrooms I grew," he said quietly. But in his eyes, Zeleth saw understanding. He knew what it meant to be desperate, to be willing to try anything when conventional options had failed. Eventually, with enormous reservations and unofficial approval, Kess agreed. The trial would proceed, documented meticulously, ready to be terminated if complications arose. Zeleth began treatment on day 1 of week 7 since the initial discovery. The protocol involved regular doses of processed chenomycin compound integrated into her diet, along with living fungal cultures that would colonize her digestive system and produce personalized variants of the protein. The first week brought no changes. Her scales continued their slow fade to gray. She documented everything with clinical precision, measuring genetic stability markers, cellular repair rates, immune response factors. The data was disappointing but not unexpected. Fundamental biological changes took time. By day 10, James suggested increasing the living culture dosage. Less processed compound, more actual fungus. Let it adapt to you specifically, learn your particular genetic patterns. It was counter to normal pharmaceutical thinking, but Zeleth had already committed to trusting James's intuition. She adjusted the protocol. On day 12, she woke to find the gray patches on her scales had stopped spreading. She ran genetic scans immediately, 3 times to confirm the results. The degradation had halted. Not reversed, not yet, but stopped. By day 15, she observed faint traces of iridescence returning to previously gray scales. Her compound eyes, which had been dimming, seemed clearer. She felt stronger, though she documented that subjective observation with appropriate skepticism. Day 20 brought undeniable results. The gray patches were shrinking, healthy iridescent scales replacing the dead tissue. Her genetic scans showed the chenomycin proteins were performing exactly as theorized, stabilizing her DNA and helping her cells remember their proper functions. More remarkably, the living fungal cultures in her gut had formed a true symbiotic relationship with her native microbiome. They were continuously producing personalized variants of chenomycin, adapting in real time to her body's needs. She contacted Keseth immediately. Her sister's face appeared on the screen, and Zeleth watched hope and fear war in her expression. "It's working," Zeleth said simply, extending her arm to show the healing scales. "Begin treatment immediately. I'm sending you the complete protocol." Word spread through the Esrilith community with a speed that caught Zeleth unprepared. Despite attempts at confidentiality, desperate families learned of the potential cure and began contacting her, begging for access to treatment. Her communication channels were overwhelmed within days. The Galactic Medical Institute formally demanded she turn over all research for proper long-term trials. They were concerned about side effects, about proper protocols, about the chaos of uncontrolled distribution. Zeleth understood their concerns. She was a scientist. She valued methodology and careful study. But she was also watching her species die, and the Institute's proposed timeline would take years. James offered a solution that was characteristically human in its audacity and simplicity. "Don't centralize it," he said during an emergency conference call that included Zeleth, Kes, and several other medical authorities. "Teach people how to grow the fungus themselves. I'll provide starter cultures, detailed cultivation instructions, everything needed. Make it something anyone can do." "That's absurd," said one of the Vrelian officials on the call. "Medical treatment requires controlled production, quality assurance, proper distribution channels." "Does it?" James asked. "Because humans survived for millennia using plants and fungi we grew in our own gardens. We didn't need corporations or centralized facilities. Every healer, every family kept their own medicinal herbs." "That was primitive medicine," the Vrelian argued. "That was resilient medicine," James countered. "You can't shut down 1,000,000 gardens. You can't monopolize something everyone can grow, and you can't destroy knowledge that's been widely shared." Zeleth felt her scales shift through a rainbow of colors as she processed the implications. James was right. Centralized production could be controlled, restricted, even weaponized. But distributed cultivation with knowledge freely shared across the galaxy would be unstoppable. "I'll support this approach," she said. Kes flickered in what might have been approval or concern. With Pleiadians it was difficult to tell. Over the following weeks, James recorded detailed cultivation guides and distributed fungal samples to hundreds of locations across known space. He held nothing back: genetic sequences, soil composition recommendations, troubleshooting guides for common problems. He made the information freely available on every major network. Zeleth contributed medical protocols, explaining how to adapt the fungus to individual S-Rilith genetic patterns, how to monitor treatment progress, what warning signs to watch for. Between them, they created a comprehensive resource that anyone with basic laboratory access could use. The Galactic Medical Institute continued to object, but couldn't stop the wave of knowledge spreading across the galaxy. Desperate S-Rilith began growing the fungus, following the protocols, starting treatment, and it worked, not for everyone. Those in very advanced stages of the withering plague showed limited improvement. The genetic damage was too extensive. But for early and middle-stage patients, the results were extraordinary. The progression stopped. Symptoms reversed. Hope, that most dangerous and necessary emotion, began to spread. 6 months after that first meeting in the market on Verdant Rest, Zelith stood before a gathering of the Galactic Medical Institute. Her scales were fully iridescent again, shifting through colors that reflected her complex emotional state. Kesith, who had started treatment early, stood beside her, showing no symptoms at all. The chamber was filled with representatives from dozens of species, all wanting to understand what had happened, how an impossible cure had emerged from a human's garden. The withering plague has not been eliminated, Zelith said clearly, but it has been stopped. S-Rilith population decline has reversed. For the first time in 2 centuries, our birth rates exceed our death rates. The chamber erupted in discussion. Questions came rapidly. How had they developed the cure so quickly? What were the long-term effects? Why had they circumvented proper testing protocols? Zelith answered each question with scientific precision, but it was her final statement that silenced the room. We succeeded because we stopped looking for a perfect solution and accepted a good one. Because a human botanist kept growing unnecessary plants for sentimental reasons. Because we were willing to try something unproven when proven methods had failed. The lesson here extends far beyond my species. James, attending the session via video link from his greenhouse, added his perspective. Humanity isn't smarter than other species. We're not more advanced, but we keep a lot of stuff around just in case. We're inefficient and redundant, and we hold on to things for irrational reasons. Sometimes that's exactly what saves you. The Galactic Medical Institute awarded both of them the Healer's Crown, the highest medical honor in known space. The ceremony was held on Verdant Rest, in James's greenhouse complex, which had become something of a pilgrimage site. After the formal proceedings ended and the dignitaries departed, Zelith walked through the greenhouse with James. The facility had expanded dramatically. Several S-Rilith researchers had joined his staff, learning cultivation techniques, establishing seed banks of their own. "I need to tell you something," Zelith said. Her scales were deep purple, gratitude and lingering sorrow. "Before I met you, I had accepted my species' extinction as inevitable. I had stopped hoping. I was just going through the motions, pretending my research mattered." James was quiet for a moment, standing among his plants, these living things he had preserved for reasons he couldn't entirely articulate. "That's the real disease," he said finally. "Not the genetic failure, the loss of hope. Everything else flows from that." "Why do you grow so many plants?" Zelith asked. "Specifically, why do you keep varieties that have no commercial value?" James reached out to touch the leaves of a small flowering plant nearby. "My wife had a garden. After she died, I couldn't save what she'd grown. I was leaving Earth. So I decided to save everything I could. Every seed variety I could find, every sample, every species. It was inefficient and illogical, and it saved your species." They stood together in the greenhouse, surrounded by thousands of plant species from Earth and dozens of other worlds, a living library of possibilities. Elsewhere in the facility, young S-Rilith children were learning to plant seeds under the guidance of older researchers. One child asked why they needed to grow so many different types when they only needed the chenomycin fungus. A teacher, scales shimmering with patience, knelt beside the child. "Because someday, someone will need something we haven't imagined yet, and if we keep enough diversity alive, it will be waiting for them." In another section, Kesith worked with a group of human and S-Rilith botanists, crossbreeding earth plants with native verdant rest species. She was healthy, vibrant, alive in a way she had not expected to be. Her children played nearby, a generation that would not grow up shadowed by extinction. The cure had spread across the galaxy now, carried by ships and networks, grown in thousands of facilities and private gardens. The S-Rilith would survive. More than survive, they would thrive again, carrying with them the lesson that efficiency was not the only virtue, that diversity was its own kind of strength. James Chen stood in his greenhouse, tending plants that served no immediate purpose, preserving seeds that might never be needed, maintaining a chaotic library of life. Around him, the galaxy was slowly learning what humanity had known instinctively. Sometimes you keep things alive simply because you can, and sometimes that makes all the difference. The withering plague had been defeated not by advanced technology or brilliant innovation, but by an old human in a garden who grew mushrooms for sentimental reasons and believed that every living thing deserved a chance to exist. It was inefficient, it was redundant, it was beautiful, and it was enough.